Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently, who've had a profound effect on our society, our history, or our culture. And tonight we're going to start out with Kim Jong-Il, who died at the age of 70. Kim Jong-Il was the murderous dictator and leader of North Korea. He had the bouffant hairdo, the jumpsuit, the platform shoes, and the ubiquitous sunglasses. He kept his country in poverty while he built a military dictatorship, and he was generally regarded as one of the most dangerous men on earth. No one knows how many starved under his leadership, while North Korea threatened South Korea with missiles and threatened the rest of the world with their nuclear program. We're going to include a report from the BBC's Matthew Bannister from The Last Word, and I think it underemphasizes the dangerous nature of Kim Jong-il and what he did to destabilize world peace. In keeping with our policy here, we will not show pictures of Kim Jong-il, merely pictures of what he did to North Korea, at least the pictures we have, because his regime was so oppressive and secretive.
In North Korea, Kim Jong-il was known as the Dear Leader. This distinguished him from his father, the great leader, Kim Il-sung. Even though he presided over a military regime which isolated the population from the outside world, forcing them to endure terrible shortages of food and fuel, there was great public mourning on news of his death. Jim Hoare is a former British chargé d'affaires. He lived in the North Korean capital Pyongyang and experienced the personality cult of Kim Jong-il.
His picture is everywhere, as is his father's picture. Every public building, and I think virtually every room in every public building, will have the pictures.
And did you see him on television?
He's shown on television, as is his father, not usually dated, not live, certainly never live. So what you see are videos of him visiting places. His favourite destination were clearly military units, but he would also visit factories, schools, universities, farms, and give on-the-spot guidance.
Simon Cockrell runs a travel company which specialises in tourist trips to North Korea. He's a regular visitor to the country.
Everybody there grows up learning stories of Kim Jong-il's exploits as a youth, what act as morality tales about his actions as a student, how he taught his teachers. So this is somebody who, although he's only spoken once in public ever, and it was nearly 20 years ago, is a daily presence in people's lives. So that's why I think it's quite a big loss. And let's not forget that although the KCNA, official North Korean news announcement of his death, did say that he'd been having medical treatment for several years, this was never reported in North Korea before that. So most people there had no idea that he had been ill.
He appeared in public on certain occasions at the Army Day parades in Pyongyang in April, and he appeared at private meetings. I went to one in April 2002, which was to commemorate his father's birthday, and he led the leadership in, and he sat in the middle, and this was a bored man. I'm not surprised, there were a whole string of long speeches, and he sat there, and he played with his pencil, and he picked up the papers, and he looked at the papers, and he threw the papers down, he picked up these papers, and he threw them down, and he looked at the ceiling, and so on, and he was bored. We saw him again a couple of weeks later at the Army Day parade when he was above us on the viewing stand, and he leant over to the diplomatic corps and applauded us. And there he was cheerful and happy. He likes that sort of thing. He likes theatrical things, I think.
Simon Cockrell also saw Kim Jong-il in person at the Grand Mass Gymnastics of 2005.
When he came out, the stadium was full, so there were probably about 250,000 people there. When he came out, everybody just went crazy and started screaming and shouting, and people crying, and everybody screams "Manse, Manse," which means 10,000 years, long life.
Where did his power derive from?
It's a very complex issue. His father's power came from having been a guerrilla leader, having had Soviet support, and then from his personal charisma. And everybody who met Kim Il-sung said he exuded charm. He could be ruthless, but he was a man who people warmed to. And he was seen by many as taking a real interest in his people. Kim Jong-il's power didn't derive from any of that, except he bathed, I suppose, in his father's reflected light.
Kim Jong-Il was known to have directed a number of films and was reputed to own an extensive movie collection, including many Hollywood titles. In 1978, he was said to have been responsible for the kidnapping of the actress Choi Eun-hee and her film director husband so that they could revitalize the North Korean movie industry. We spoke to her through a translator.
My first impression of Kim Jong-il was when I was invited to a dinner after being kept at his country house for about a week. When I went to the party, I was worried about what was going to happen to me. And he said, "Miss Che, look at me. Don't you think I look like a midget? I'm very fat. I look awful." And I think by saying this, he was trying to break the ice. And he treated me very well. He had very big eyes, and he was very small. And he wore shoes with a built-up heel to make himself look taller. He watched a lot of old American films, and I remember that he liked Elizabeth Taylor very much. At dinner, he liked to listen to singing and asked me to sing old songs that were popular in South Korea.
He didn't travel by aeroplane. He had a special train. It was a very lavishly appointed train. And he used that train to travel around the country. And he also went regularly to China and to Russia in the train. The train, it was said, was very disruptive once it got out of North Korean space, territorial space, because everything else would be stopped on the lines while it came through. There was a famous trip in 2001 when he went to Russia. And for months afterwards, there were displays up with little lights on them showing the route that the train had followed, and the lights would flick on as it went through various stations.
Asking somebody if they didn't like Kim Jong-il in North Korea would be like going to the Vatican and asking somebody if they didn't like the Pope. It's a futile and pointless question which can only be answered in one way.
He had a very strong will, and he devoted his energy to doing what he wanted.
When we see people crying in the streets as a result of Kim Jong-il's death, is that genuine? Is it a kind of mass hysteria? Is it staged?
It's probably elements of all three. There is a Korean way of mourning which involves a very strong display of emotion, and that is what you see in public. People who have defected or become refugees who were there in 1994 when Kim Il-sung died have said that they were told to go up to the statue and show your grief, and they know how to show their grief. And some will get carried away, and some will be genuinely sorry. Some will also be sorry, apprehensive perhaps about what the future might bring.
Jim Hoare on Kim Jong-il, who's died aged 69.
And normally the BBC does the best obituaries on these people, but you've got to wonder when the BBC is talking more about his love for Elizabeth Taylor than the starvation in North Korea. Here's the writer Christopher Hitchens on Kim Jong-il and the state of North Korea, which he visited. And Christopher Hitchens was the great expatriate British writer who became an American citizen. In one of our obituary coincidences, Hitchens died within 1 day of Kim Jong-il, and we'll use his commentary as a tribute to Christopher Hitchens.
I went to North Korea, finally got in. Took me a long time, had to go under a second identity, had to pay a huge bribe. I was there, I got there. And I thought, I know what I'm not going to say about North Korea. I'm not going to say it. That school children are marched to school carrying pictures of the dear leader and the great leader. The loudspeakers speak of nothing but the great leader and the dear leader. At workplaces, there are sessions set apart every day for cries of hatred against the United States and the West and South Korea. I'm still not going to do it. They won't make me say 1984. They just won't make me do it. But eventually they make you do it. You have to, your mind just adjusts to it. The North Korean state was founded in 1950, 51. That's the year 1984 was published for the first time. You think, could it be that someone handed a Korean translation of this to Kim Il-sung and said, "Do you think we could make this fly?" And he said, page through, said, "I don't know, but we could sure give it the old college try," because that's what it looks as if they did. There is no private life for a North Korean. There isn't a moment when you are not either on parade or when you're not on parade, told to stay indoors. You're not wanted, stay at home, you're under curfew. Lights are out in Pyongyang, and that's the capital city. At 8:30, can't go out after that, stay in. There's nothing to watch, there's nothing to see. All television programs, when it's working, are all about the dear leader, as are all operas, all films, all concert performances, and all public lectures. There's nothing else to talk about. The life of the human being, this is what I failed to convey in my article, is completely pointless. There's the concept of liberty or humor or irony or happiness or love doesn't exist. You are there simply as a prop for the state. And though it used to be, as with any slave system, that they would feed you in return for your services, that compact broke down a couple of decades ago. Now they don't feed you either. They barely clothe you. That Panmunjom, the so-called demilitarized zone, you've seen the word demilitarized zone, haven't you, in the press, even quite recently. Why do they call it demilitarized zone? Words lose their meaning so fast. It's the most militarized zone on the planet. There are nuclear mines sown in that DMZ. There's a concentration of force and violence on either side of it that is unequaled anywhere. It's the most militarized zone in the world. That's the only place where North Korean and South Korean soldiers meet directly, face to face, staring at each other across the table. They change guard about 5 or 6 times a day. The North Koreans naturally put up their best soldiers to stand there, put the best, bravest, toughest face on North Korea. The best ones they can find are 6 inches shorter than the South Korean ones. That's what a famine state is, on top of a slave state. We now have millions and millions of North Korean children totally stunted in mind and body, who will have to be dealt with at some point, who have been raised to believe that they live in a regime that is run by a god. And I must just indicate, but I was going to do this later, but I'll say it now. There's a thing that it took me ages to notice about reading George Orwell's 1984. I wrote a book about it. I've written many articles about it. It took me a long time to notice something that's so obvious that it's crying to be said. In 1984, it's assumed there's no more religion. There's no church in 1984, not even a tame state church. There's nothing. No one mentions the idea of faith, except in Big Brother. Quite interesting. It's as if it's an entirely secular dictatorship. In North Korea, you might think that was the case, since it has an officially communistic ideology, but it's not. It's the most religious state it's possible to imagine. It's actually two people who have been fused into one. Maybe this is reminding you of something. There's the father, and there's the son. It's one short of a trinity. Another way of phrasing it is this. When the president, our president, writes to Kim Jong-Il, the son, the dear leader, he doesn't call him dear Mr. President. He calls him dear Mr. Secretary. You ever noticed that? Why is that? Because he's not the president of North Korea. He's the head of the Communist Party, the North Korean Workers' Party, and he's the head of the army. He's not head of the state. The head of the state is his father, who's been dead for 15 years. So it's a necrocracy, if you like. Or a mausolocracy, or a thanatocracy, in which the one has been fused into being with the other, and where both of them are said to have had miraculous births, attended by miraculous phenomena, such as, for example, birds singing in Korean when they were born. So that this is possibly the most theocratic country I've ever seen, or that there has ever been, where the only duty of the citizen, starving and stunted and enslaved, as he or she may be, is the worship of the leader and of the leader's father. I did not see this happen, but a friend of mine swears to it. Getting tired of, you can't go to the opera, can't go to the TV, you can't go, no movies, nothing except long live the dear leader. He went to the zoo just to have a walk around the park. And there were some animals, rather morose, half-starved animals, but there they were. And he got to the parrot section, and there was a big parrot who looked at him in a sort of beady way. And he looked at the parrot in a rather morose manner. And after a short interval, the parrot opened its beak and said, "Long live the dear leader, Kim Il-sung." the only comment it felt able to make. I don't know, but I'll tell you what. I didn't see it, I can't swear to it, but I don't disbelieve it.
I think Hitchens may have mixed up Kim Jong-Il with Kim Il-sung there, but that was Christopher Hitchens, great writer, Marxist, atheist, iconoclast, true American, and most importantly, against tyranny and never boring. And we're going to miss Christopher Hitchens also. We're going to move on from Christopher Hitchens and talk about our main subject tonight, the hero of Czechoslovakia, Vaclav Havel. Havel was a politician, a playwright, and a Czech leader. He was a hero of the struggle that ended the Cold War. He died recently at the age of 75. Havel was very popular and led Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution to peacefully end 45 years of communist rule. As the president of Czechoslovakia, he oversaw the country's transition from communism into a free market economy. Despite opposing the country's split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, he ensured that the split was peaceful, and he resigned as the country's first post-communist president in 1992 so he could avoid some of the factional turmoil that was associated with the split. The following year, he was elected president of the Czech Republic and helped it join NATO, where he helped stand up for the United States when democracies of old Europe opposed many American policies, including the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He was also a huge fan of rock music, and in 1990 he invited Frank Zappa to play in Prague. He left office in 2003, but was credited with laying the groundwork that brought the Czech Republic into the European Union. After this, he returned to writing, and he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in his defense of the downtrodden everywhere. Here is the BBC's Matthew Bannister from Last Word talking about Vaclav Havel. And again, I'd be remiss if I didn't note the BBC's emphasis on Havel's leadership of the Czechoslovakia after the Soviet Union broke down, rather than his resistance to the Soviets, where he was his most heroic.
Now, world leaders gathered in Prague earlier today for the funeral of the playwright and former Czech president Vaclav Havel. He was imprisoned a number of times for his opposition to the communist regime and eventually led its overthrow in 1989. We asked his friend of 50 years, the distinguished writer Ivan Klima, to describe one memory which summed up Václav Havel. His piece is read by Peter Marinka.
Analýza z vězení. O Václavu Havlovi se říkalo.
Analysis from prison. It's been said and written about Václav Havel that he was shy, but this word is not quite right for the man who was surely one of the most famous personalities in the second half of the last century. It can be said that he was reticent, preferring to hear others first before speaking up himself, but it could always be expected that he would speak wisely and knowledgeably. There's a scene that is fixed in my memory. Václav has been released from prison with pneumonia and is now in hospital under Petchin Hill. We are going to see him. We haven't made an arrangement, but when my wife and I come to the hospital, there's already a group of friends waiting there. And now Václav, wearing a hospital dressing gown, comes in. He's smiling and asking questions. What news has there been in the 4 months that he was in prison? What's the situation in the Charter? And what's the situation in society? What are we preparing for? And what is our beloved power preparing for? We reply, speaking over one another, and when it seems that we've said it all, it is as if it were his turn to speak. No, he didn't summarize what we were saying. He presented a brilliant analysis of the current political situation and the regime that was, in his view, quickly reaching the point of collapsing and falling. When we expressed mild surprise as to where he got this information from and where he found his optimism, he told us that he had learned to read Rude Pravo, the Communist Party newspaper, very thoroughly. Of course, it's not enough to read Rude Pravo very thoroughly. What is required is to have quite a specific type of analytic mind, able to connect what appears at first sight to be completely disconnected and to reach conclusions that even a thorough reader would be unable to reach. This was precisely Václav's kind of mind, and he would never hide the conclusions that he reached, which is why the communist power hated him so much, and why he became the leading personality of the opposition to this regime.
For weeks, the crowds have been chanting Havel to the castle. This morning, Václav Havel went to Prague Castle to be inaugurated as the first president of the new Czechoslovakia. It was an extraordinary moment, as the dissident who spent 5 years in jail signed on for the country's supreme office.
I asked the Czech-born broadcaster and journalist Sir John Tusa if Václav Havel was a reluctant president.
I don't think he was reluctant in the sense that he didn't want to do it. I think he knew he had to do it. What I think kept him doing it was his writers' and playwrights' shrewd observation of the foibles of life. He couldn't stop smiling. He wrote a wonderful autobiography called To the Castle, where what he does is he takes a lot of the emails that he wrote when he was president, and then years later he read through those and then wrote a commentary on them. And the thing that really got up his nose was not troubles with foreign countries and foreign governments. The thing that comes through time and time again is that he, the president of the Czech Republic, couldn't get the IT to work. And while this was deeply frustrating, I think it also rather amused him. And you have to have a sense of the ridiculous to enjoy that. Sometimes, and quite surprisingly, he would lapse, deliberately of course, into quite wild farce. He liked the absurd, but there was this combination between the absurd and the very serious.
And we all are a little bit what we were yesterday, and a little bit what we are today, and also a little bit we are not these things. We all are a little bit all the time, and all the time we are not a little bit. Some of us are more, and some of us are more not.
I don't think his plays stand comparison with the great playwrights of the 20th century, and there's no point in pretending that they do. But then they weren't presidents of a country. They weren't people who led their countries out of dictatorship into freedom.
It's been said that he was somebody perhaps who was more appreciated outside his own country than he was within it.
I think it's very much the case that outside the Czech Republic, we all said, fine writer, dissident, man of principle, man of strength, man of courage. He was all those things. And to be fair to the Czech people, they probably needed a bit more bread and butter and jam in their politics than that. And those were not Havel's strengths.
What do you think his legacy is to the contemporary Czech Republic?
What contemporary Czechs are working towards is a rediscovery and a redefinition of what they call civil society, which they rather lost. Once they got freedom then produced some really rather unpleasant and undesirable characteristics of, a hell for leather and the market before everything. And I believe that people will turn back to Havel and say, what did he mean? What did he represent? What does he have to offer to these new set of values, or rediscovered set of values, which can then be put into operation? So I think in 5 to 10 years' time, everything he said will come again.
Sir John Tusa on Václav Havel, who's died aged 75.
I think you might see a thin strain of mild socialist bias there by the BBC on that interview, which minimizes the accomplishments of Václav Havel, who was indeed one of the great figures of the second half of the 20th century, and who was a leader in freeing a major part of Eastern Europe. Well, we're going to close on that note tonight. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. And in closing, we're going to play a little bit of Czech music instead of Frank Zappa. We're going to play a snippet of the New World Symphony by the Czech composer Antonín Dvořák, because indeed, Václav Havel helped bring in a new world in Eastern Europe. And Dvořák's music was played at his funeral.